Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to Regulation Navigation with Warren Miller, brought to you by ITS. This is our third informational session in our series centered on important topics around operator qualification, or as we all know it very well by, OQ. We hope this will be an opportunity for you to learn something new today or validate what you already know. And today's topic is span of control, understanding its importance and use in the industry. I'm Chris Taylor, the Creative Director here at ITS, and I'm facilitating this discussion. With me is former PHMSA regulator and ITS regulatory compliance specialist, Warren Miller, and ITS's Midstream Services representative, David Landry. Thank you both for being with us today. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session will be recorded. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please submit those into the chat box. We'll have time at the end of the discussion for Warren and David to answer your questions. And if we're unable to answer your question during the session, we'll follow up afterwards. And just a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series should not be utilized as your only source of information when responding to an audit or in your operations. Let's lay out today's discussion. We're going to start by building an understanding of what exactly span of control is and why it's used. We'll be talking about what a qualified observer is and their responsibilities. And we'll dive into what we'll call regulator red flags, or the possible common misuses of span of control, as well as some possible solutions to help operators and contractors with OQ field verification and documentation. So let's jump in. So to kick things off, Warren, can you define span of control for us and why it's used in the industry?
You bet. Chris, actually span of control is not defined in the regulation. If you look at 192.805C and 195.50C, it has an allowance that individuals that aren't qualified by OQ to perform a covered task have to be directed and observed by an individual. Span of control is considered that ratio of qualified individual to the unqualified individuals performing that covered task. The actual term span of control was actually developed. It wasn't addressed in the regulation. It was actually developed during the development of the protocols that RISPA, prior to PHMSA, developed to inspect each operator's OQ program. And again, it was something that was thought of by myself and some other regulators. Sorry to take the blame.
Well, that is so interesting. It's actually the term span of control is not in the regulations, but it is defined. And again, I guess to recap, it is set by the operator, and it is a per covered task ratio of non-qualified individuals to qualified individuals, where those non-qualified individuals are being observed by that qualified individual.
Right,
Warren,
directed and observed, yes, sir.
Okay, directed and thank you. Warren, can you walk us through what the responsibilities of that qualified observer are?
It's actually quite a list. You know, one is making sure that they actually are performing the right covered task and the location as you would any covered task. The individual or individuals would be have the correct PE. That individual that's qualified, he's the one that's actually got to be documenting the performance of that covered task. I don't want an individual that's unqualified actually signing off on a valve inspection because if it comes up to be looked at in records by a regulator, he's going to see a name, going to check it. It's an unqualified person has actually signed off on the performance. Unless the operator has got an incredible way to good documentation shows under span of control, I would really suggest strongly that that qualified individual sign off on that covered task. Stopping the work of the covered task if he's leaving, if the qualified individual is leaving the immediate area, making sure that they don't continue to perform the covered task, doing cleanup work or something else. He or she has got to be able to recognize or react to AOCs while those individuals performing the covered task and jump in there in case something does go wrong. They'd also have to know what the span of control is for each covered task that they're observing. If they're out in the field, depending on the covered task, again, the numbers change. Another thing that's very big is to be able to take actions to reduce that span of control ratio if the conditions impair their ability to actually be able to direct and observe the performance of those folks, whether it's in a ditch, if it's raining, loud situation where you can't hear and communicate, definitely they need to have that ability. Certainly that individuals also got to know company procedures for the tasks being observed or know where to get them. And then another big thing is the right and ability to stop work if needed. Most operators have that for anybody in the field, but certainly for that qualified individual to have that right and ability.
A lot of things writing on that qualified observer. And as on screen, even I didn't even realize or think about that the correct personal protective equipment would even be a consideration, but that's really interesting. All those items. David, how are qualified observers prepared? Is there training provided to qualified observers about their responsibilities while they're directing and observing non-qualified individuals conducting covered tasks?
Sure, and there should be. I'm hoping that all operators do. The operator should, in their OQ plan, have something written about the span of control and the observer observing the person doing the work. It should define what those responsibilities are. It should define what the requirements might be that would suggest reducing that span of control for any reason. Just whatever the company's procedures and policies are around that. And that should be trained to all their employees. It should be provided anytime the OQ plan is trained to the employee, whether they're a new hire or whether there's a modification in OQ plan and they do a training for the company wide. And that training really should be documented somewhere that we did this training. These are the people that were in the class, and this is what we covered, to include this span of control, because not only the person directing, observing needs to know what the responsibilities are, but the people being observed need to know what that person's responsibility are as well.
That is interesting. And so training should be conducted. It should be documented. And I'm sure there's a number of ways to do that training. Maybe a JSA or what else do you see? What are the ways that typically are that's done?
Sure. Initially, it should be trained through the OQ plan. Every employee should be trained on the OQ plan, what it says. The other critical thing is whoever's doing span of control or observing that span of control has to have the span of control for the tasks they're doing. And how do you provide that to your employees? Is that through an itemized list in the project folder? Is that provided electronically? How do you do that? But typically, initially, the training should come from the company during the OQ plan review and then reviewed periodically. And that can be reviewed during the JSA. You can have a spot in the JSA that speaks about span of control and responsibilities real quick, recap, everybody acknowledge. It could also be a part of onboarding. So if you're onboarding, or even if you have a contractor onboarding process where a contractor is coming into the company to do work, have an onboarding process that covers that span of control while they're on job sites, because they're going to be working under that operator's span of control, not their own. The operator is the one that sets that span of control. The contractor must work under that operator's span of control. And how do they know what that is unless you've provided it to them?
Makes sense. So help me with this. So typically, I'm sure this varies completely across, but the industry, across jobs. But you know, how many non-qualified individuals to qualified individuals are there typically on a job? And David, can you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, it's going to vary. B31 initially, when it came out, started a span of control for each task, industry-based, each task in the industry based on the difficulty or the importance of the task. Originally, span of control in B31 started in as far open as 1-to-5 ratio, 1 qualified person to 5 non-qualified people. In the more recent versions, that's reduced down to a maximum of 1-to-3 right now. That's the maximum span of control in B31 based on a task. And those were those span of controls were decided upon by industry leaders in the B31Q committee initially, and that's a guide to go by. After that, it's really up to the operator to review each task to see, is it practical? For example, if you have a rectifier and you have a span of control to 1-to-3, is it really practical for 3 people to be in front of a rectifier with their head in the rectifier and their hands in the rectifier doing an inspection on a rectifier? Is that a practical span of control? Can it really occur safely without somebody getting hurt? So each operator has to go through each of the span of controls in each of the tasks that they have and say, yes, we're going to agree on that span of control, or, you know, we're going to reduce that. We just don't feel it's safe at that. We're going to reduce it. And that should all be documented in their OQ program, specifically per task, what the span of control is and why they came up with that span of control. Some tasks are required 1-to-0, and because of the training requirements and everything on that task. So the more critical tasks, your welding, your fusion tasks, are 1-to-0. They don't allow for a span of control because they're too critical of a task. And a matter of fact, they also don't allow for the qualification to occur live on the system. That on a regulated system, you have to do it in a mock-up in a simulation of some sort to be able to do that span of control, the initial qualification. And without a span of control, that person has to be the qualified person.
So that's really interesting. So if I'm hearing you, if I can recap this, you know, around the reduction consideration. So if I'm in a scenario of I have a basic task of turning a valve, and it's a 1-to-3 ratio. So 1 qualified individual can observe 3 unqualified individuals. But let's say I'm in a confined space. So are you saying that an operator's plan could and probably should have conditions that would possibly make that a 1-to-0 for that basic task under that condition?
Well, the plan can have a 1-to-3 span of control, but the plan should allow for the person on site that's doing the observation to be able to reduce that span of control based on the safety going on the job site. So it could be a confined space where you can't allow 3 people down in the valve, or that valve might be a critical valve that would shut down the system and if an error were made. So it may just be a service or maintenance on the valve where they have to turn it a few turns in order to make sure it operates. And if messed up, it could shut down the line. So they may reduce that span of control to 1-to-0 because it's a critical valve versus a standard valve.
So it really does come down to the context of the environment and where that task is being and what that task is being conducted on.
Absolutely. If that valve is being used to blow down a 1,000-pound pipeline, you're not going to be able to hear each other talk while that valve is blowing that pipeline down. So your span of control would need to be reduced, because if you can't tell the person to stop, you can't control the environment for safety. So if the valve is being used to blow down a system, you definitely could easily need to reduce that span of control as well.
That's a great example, I think, of the direction part of span of control. Not only is it observing, but it's also they're tasked with directing and observing. Warren, is it allowed for qualified observers to direct and observe more than one covered task being performed at the same time?
Chris, the regulation is actually silent on numbers or quantity. as a former regulator, we looked at that as something that would be difficult to do. Always believed that if an individual was looking at regulator work and in the reg station, along with wrapping pipe, if you were wrapping or working on exposed pipe, repairing coating all at the same time inside of a reg station, that you'd have a hard time staying focused on one or the other. Actually, the language that had come out in the proposed NPRM that was proposed in July of 2015, that did not go into final rule and has since died, specifically addressed that would only allow one covered task to be directed and observed by a qualified individual. And I would really recommend that you consider adopting that as a best practice, because again, it was written down and it had been commented on, it had been as far up as to being into regulation. So there is language out there, and I'd consider that as a best practice, just for, as we just talked about, the responsibilities of that qualified individual and what they've got to do for a single task. And then you're talking about multiple tasks and being able to do it all for both of them. You can see that it could take quite a bit.
Yeah, and would it be fair enough to kind of, and maybe you've seen this in other regulations, points that actually have made it to final rule, but the kind of points that are in there, do they ever creep back up in future NPRMs? And do you expect this may be one of those?
Yeah, I would expect, even though this one, died in July of 2020, just due to the 5-year window that an NPRM has to become a final rule, I would expect something eventually on OQ. Can't tell you exactly when. Love to be able to say when, but with the mega rule still in development of the second and third parts, I don't think that there will be many changes on other regulations till that's complete. But I think that could certainly raise itself up again in the future.
Yeah, and so another follow-up to this question, again of, are they allowed to, and they're silent on there, are they allowed to direct and observe on more than one covered task at the same time? I guess, how close in proximity should the observer be? Obviously, probably not out in their work truck, observing from afar, but can you speak a little bit to that?
It really would depend on the task. If you're observing 3 people coating a piece of pipe, being able to see if there's deficiencies in the pipe, wrapping as if you've got good vision, if it's something like if you're in a regulator station and you're watching somebody work on a regulator relief device, you've got to be up close to be able to see the detail, be able to step in if something goes wrong. That's the big thing, is have that ability to recognize it and then to react to an AOC. And there was misconception by a number of operators that somebody could walk back and forth between 2 bell holes 25 foot apart. But again, once you're out of sight, you're not being directed and observed, or you're not directing and observing. And so that does not meet what the regulators are looking for in a qualified direct and observer.
Interesting. And one more real quick, does it always have to be on the pipeline system, like in the right of way? I mean, are there any, can span of control apply to the control room?
It is in the control room, because that is a facility. It's okay. Not on the right of way, but it's not a control room on a jurisdictional pipe is considered part of the facility.
Awesome. So those are really good examples, I think, of the application of span of control. But Warren and David touched on this just a little bit when talking about the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, or ASME B31Q standard. But Warren, can you tell us about how operators go about deciding the ratio of span of control for each of their covered tasks?
I can. Early on when folks were developing their span of control, a lot of them were doing it individually, and trying to say, okay, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and they would look at the criticality and the complexity of their tasks and the frequency, and trying to say, okay, these our top 6 that are in that high criticality, high complexity. We need to, consider that as a different ratio than just painting for corrosion or marking a pipeline. And that was how it started. Certainly if a company is large enough to have subject matter experts, they can provide information on some of that criticality and complexity. The standard ASME B31Q, they actually use 200 SMEs from across the country, different kinds of operators, liquid gas distribution, to develop span of control and reevaluation intervals using that same, but it was usually diff analysis, which was the difficulty and importance, because frequency depends on each operator. Some operators hot tap every single day. Some operators may hot tap once every 7 years. So it really, that's where it varied, and that's where the standard can only, come down so far. And as you see with this regulation, one size does not fit all. At one time we talked about, as a regulator, we talked about developing a covered task list that all the operators would be able to have. They could pick and choose and, be done with it. But, the city, a small propane company that has 11 mobile homes is not the same as a Colonial Pipeline. And so, there's no way to actually set that up because of the difference in resources, the difference in personnel and in operations itself.
So if I'm hearing right, a number of considerations should go into deciding the ratio of span of control. You can use established recommendations. You have to adopt them yourselves, but considering things like difficulty, importance, criticality, frequency, and even complexity of said tasks should inform that definition of the ratio of span of control.
Right. And one of the things that you and David just talked about a minute ago with with those one-offs, like, decide, and that's just it, having it as a one-off. So you would establish your requirement of 1 to 3 on that valve. But also, if you've trained that qualified individual to say, hey, we do have, or it may be even a company decision on this, anytime that we have I'm sorry, I just went blank.
Well, like the blow down kind of scenario, I think, like
having to go into a pit, if we have to don, air and things like that, we're going to minimize that number because of safety concerns for personnel. So 1 qualified individual is going to enter instead of 4. But that would not be something that you would have in your span of control. It would be something you would have specific to operations. So, making sure you don't put yourself in the corner by trying to, address all the different variations you're going to have in your span of control list. Do that in your operations.
Yeah, and that, I think it underscores the whole purpose of span of control really is to maintain safety, right? You want, and that you're staying in compliance, like the tasks being conducted are being conducted by qualified individuals or directed and observed by them.
Well, the thing with span of control was developed and allowed in the regulation when they were first putting this together, because there were operators that were not going to be able to get all of their people qualified within that certain time frame of the regulatory development. So these were for those operators who had 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 employees, and they couldn't get everybody qualified. It was never intended for a, 20 years later, we've got people that aren't qualified and they're still not qualified. This was for that development. And certainly now with new employees coming on, it's taken on a different light because we have new people having to come into the industry to replace folks that are leaving.
Sure.
So it's as important as it is now as it was when it first came out in '99.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it provides some really necessary flexibility, if you will, and for exactly those reasons. Warren, through your years of being a regulator, I'm sure you've seen your share of misuses when it comes to span of control. Can you share with us like typical red flags that you've seen that you as an inspector or as a regulator would flag to you as possibly something to really dig into?
You bet. And this was something I actually trained inspectors on, was when you pull up to a location, before you get out of the vehicle, spot where everybody is, because you don't know what's going on, but, until you get out there and talk, you're not going to know, what the work actually is. But sometimes you'll spot somebody in a truck that's actually the qualified person, and he may be taking a call, he may be doing records, but if he's supposed to be over the work site and watching somebody actually work at that point, you've got an issue. So, I recommend anybody doing some of their own on-site inspections, just to ensure that your qualified people are doing the observing and directing and observing correctly, that they're not wandering away from the work site. Certainly inability to address the span of control situation at a location. So getting out there, I'm asking, okay, well, is span of control being utilized? Well, it is. Okay, who is it? Who's being the directed and observing? What's your documentation? Again, JSAs on site, electronically, having something set where you've already established before everybody does the work, okay, Bill and John, they're unqualified. George is going to be overseeing them. He's going to direct and observe. That's established for that covered task. And it may be flip-flop for the next one. The guy that's qualified for another task may be unqualified for one. It depends on who's doing what. And that's the opportunity that companies can do. They don't have to qualify everybody on every single covered task. They can vary if they use that span of control, but have to also follow that span of control correctly on site. When I'm looking at a plan, if I see span of control ratio is the same for every covered task, I get that goosey feeling that they haven't done their homework to find out, because there are certainly tasks that, are very much more complex, have a higher consequence than others. And so if I see span of control 1 to 3, 1 to 5, every one, it makes me kind of nervous. And then, not having any training established for that qualified observer. You kind of set him up to fail, him or her to fail, if they don't know exactly what all they're, required to do. And in doing so, it puts that operator at risk, because if something does get missed, if it's documented wrong, you can have an incident, accident, you can get, getting a compliance letter from the regulators. You want to make sure you've got those things established.
Thank you for that. Those are really great points to be aware of, I think, as an operator. Warren, you've put together a couple of real world cases, but like last time and in our last webinar, you genericized the details of the operator for the notice of amendment. Will you take us through these?
Sure. This first one, again, is an actual letter that was actually the first letter that went out to an operator by PHMSA that addressed the span of control. And they actually addressed the 3 covered tasks that are listed here. It's all in the cathodic protection family, but they had a span of control of 1 to 3, and they were called on it. And the regulator says, physically, how can you be doing that? How can you tell me that you're going to have 3 people, again, checking in an interference bond with 3 sets of equipment while a qualified individual is observing? Understanding some of these locations, you couldn't get 4 people around some of these locations, let alone 2 or 3. So they actually have said, you've really got to look at your plan and see if you can physically do a 1 to 3. And that was the first time. So, but it has been called out, so precedent has been set. So they do ask that question occasionally. So if you've got a span of control that's higher than you would really normally do, you might consider looking at those again and seeing what really works for your company. If you've only got 2 line locators or 3 pieces of equipment, are you going to use all 3 of them at one location in a 1 to 3? Those kind of things. The second one is actually a accident that occurred, and this involved the control room, actually, where a previously qualified controller had been off duty for quite a bit of time, so he was no longer considered qualified. He was assigned to work a console, and the other controller, who is qualified, was supposed to be directing and observing him. And over the course of the shift, of course, the other controller had his console that he was working, plus other activities, and failed to observe the unqualified individual actually make incorrect operations, which actually went past an AOC and ended up causing an accident. And in doing so, besides being written up, and they had a $100,000 fine for that one instance. So there are ramifications for not ensuring that the span of control is met, and really want to make sure if you've got any questions about it that you ask.
Excellent advice, and thank you for kind of showing us the real world cases that genericized, of course, but that there is precedent set on span of control.
You bet.
We've talked through what span of control is. We've talked about the responsibilities of the qualified observer. We've talked about typical red flags seen in the field. David, are there any solutions to help document these processes in span of control?
There are. The methods that are currently used, or the approaches that are currently used, hopefully the operator has documented their span of control and how they came up with their span of control in their OQ plan. But also available on site, typically what we'll see is they'll fill out a JSA, and in that JSA they may be talking about the tasks and span of control, but somewhere they've got to get the span of control for each of those tasks to include in that JSA. So they've got, how are you getting those individual span of controls for each task being done on that specific job? Also, you'll see field records. The inspector or the project manager will be filling out field records of who was on site, who checked in for the day, things like that, and marrying over their operator qualifications for that. The risk to that, there's a risk to that, as well as like contractor daily reports. So contractors will turn in a daily report to the operator, especially if they're working independently out in the system. They were out, these were the people that were out, this is the work they did for the day. And if you pull those qualifications for those individuals, you'll include that with it. But the risk of all this is you may have 4 or 5 people on the site, and you've got 5 people documented a task with a span of control, 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. So which of those employees actually physically did the task? And the worst thing you could ever have is an auditor walk up and say, okay, you guys were the ones that did this project. You did the coding on this pipe. Who all did the coding? And as they all raise their hand, and there's 4 people that raise their hand, and your span of control is 1 to 2, 1 to 3, we know we got a problem. So it's not guaranteed proof. There's always a risk in filling paperwork out. You could miss checking off an item. You could miss writing down an item. You could misdocument somebody's qualifications. So the resolution to that would be electronic. Just like the way we do all of our OQ, the testing's electronic, the evaluations are electronic. We've developed an app called Verify, which is an electronic means of logging each person in on the job. Once they're logged in on the job, then they can go ahead and assign those span of controls, and they don't have the ability. The electronic digital system stops them from exceeding the span of control. So on every job, the individuals that did that performance. So there's no way of accidentally exceeding your span of control, and you've got documentation you can provide back to your auditor that you can feel confident with. And then it removes so much of the human error risk out of that process. So it reduces the human risk. It also reduces the ability for the information to be altered. The last thing you want to find out is if there's an incident on site and somebody grabbed the paperwork and want to scratch your name off so they didn't get in trouble. This will actually reduce or eliminate the ability to make those changes. And frankly, you don't have to worry about that paperwork getting from the field back to the office and be readable when it gets there, because after it rides in the back of the truck for a week and finally makes it back to the office, between the coffee, the chewing tobacco, and whatever they had for lunch, you might be able to read between the stains, you may not, and it may get to the right project manager, it may not. So by doing it electronically, you really reduce all those risks, and you get solid documentation that you can include in every project or every job to prove span of control on everything you're doing on your system.
Wow. So it sounds like, using a technology approach like this, a solution like this, it marries together not only, OQ verification prior to conducting tasks, but also documents any span of control needed, any OQs conducted, maybe critical tasks even conducted, and it's all documented in process and systematized, if you will. So I think the end result, it sounds like it's, okay, you are in an inspection, you are being asked for these records. I could just, all those number of ways that seems like that are the typical ways of documenting this, that seems like a major nightmare of just even pulling all that out, parsing it out. And I know we've talked in the past too about because of that, you may be providing a whole lot more information than you really need to. So, a solution like this does it have great reporting? I mean, is it quick to get the details out?
Absolutely. Just like all of our reports, you have filters you can sort through to, based on the job that was done, based on the date and time that it was done. There's filters that you can sort through, and then you just download a PDF or put it in an Excel spreadsheet and get it where it needs to be for those project records to be permanently maintained.
Interesting. And I'm sure it's just really easy to use.
Absolutely.
Huh. Well, thank you. That's definitely something that I'd be looking into if my process was, kind of ad hoc. Well, let's recap. David, can you take us through? We like to have the top 5 takeaways for a session like this. So, David, will you take us through those?
Sure. Number 1 would be ensuring that employees performing the span of control are properly trained, and that responsibility is documented somewhere that they've been trained on what they're supposed to be doing, and making sure they know that they can reduce that span of control if the environment requires them to be able to maintain safety and quality of the work being done. You also want to make sure that all employees are trained on the exceptions of the span of control. Not just the people doing the observation. All employees, it's critical for them to know what span of control is about and what the responsibilities are, because they need to understand why this person's directing them the way they are. Span of control is properly documented for each job to prove to inspectors. You know, the worst thing you can do is abide by your span of control and then not be able to show the documentation for it to your inspector. And then, of course, setting your span of control based on the importance, the difficulty, the frequency, and every operator is different. You've got small municipalities where you've got a lot of people trained on so many tasks, and some of those tasks they may not do but once every 2 years. So do you really want them to be able to have a larger span of control, and do you want to increase the frequency of training? So it's not a one size fits all. You want to customize that to your company. And making sure your OQ plan has all the proper documentation of how you came up with your span of control, what you reviewed, what your decisions were, and why you decided what you decided. And then also you want to make sure that the person with the responsibility of overseeing knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing.
Thank you for that. And we'll be sure to send these top 5 takeaways to you in an email following this presentation. We're coming up at our kind of established time. We've got plenty of room though for questions from our audience. I believe we've already received a couple. And we'd like to give you a chance. Again, you can put that into your GoToWebinar chat box, and Kayla Huggins, the ITS marketing officer, will help us get those to the panel here. So Kayla, what do we got so far?
Hey guys, so Warren, I know there was a question that came through a little bit earlier that you wanted to kind of tackle first, so I'll let you take that one and read it to the group and we can discuss it here.
You bet. And one thing before I do these questions, one thing that will also come to you with the 5 takeaways is going to be a link to a page on the PHMSA webpage that actually has the history on OQ and all the development, all the meetings. So you'll understand a lot more about the background, especially if you're new to OQ, about why some of the things occurred and how it occurred in the time that was involved for a lot of the development. So the first question talks about 192.627, which talks about tapping pipelines under pressure. And the question says, first, I assume this would also include the stopple or shut off of the said pipeline. And yes, it would also include stopping. The guidance material suggests that the operator should consider using their OQ program to establish tapping qualification criteria, but is silent on the span of control. The PHMSA enforcement information notes that a possible violation is the allowance of an unqualified individual making the tap. So is PHMSA telling us that you must be OQ'd to perform this covered task and not allow a span of control over an unqualified individual? If so, can the unqualified individual be assigned work that does not include the actual cutting of the pipeline, such as assisting in the construction for the equipment, taking measurements, etc., everything other than cutting the pipe? B31Q and the API standard allow a span of control, and ask, what is your opinion? First off, 627 actually says that each tap made on a pipeline under pressure must be performed by a crew qualified to make hot taps. So this was in place before operator qualification came into being in 1999. So there was already a requirement that the crews be qualified. Since 627 is underneath the operation and operations sorry, subsection, the section, it falls underneath OQ also. I have looked at it and inspected this as saying that the individual that is performing the measuring and cutting would be that person that has to be OQ'd. The other part of the crew would not have to be OQ'd, but they'd have to be qualified to do the additional work, such as fitting up, bolting on, anything that does not involve the integrity of the pipe. But once that the measuring, which is an integral part of the cut, is being done, that individual would have to be OQ'd. And again, this is me. I am no longer PHMSA. Make sure you understand that it may be that you want to qualify everybody, but I believe it's the individual that is running the show, that is making the cut and measuring. His responsibility falls under OQ, and everybody else would not. And that would be the 1-to-2 ratio. Again, with the criticality of the task, I think that you have to minimize your span of control.
So Warren, if I can expand on that. So
Sure.
in a typical tapping, you've got flanges. So people will be qualified under flanges under a different process. You'll have valves. People will be qualified under the valves under different processes. So if they're doing flanges, they're doing valves to do all the fit up, that would fall under other qualifications, and certainly they would have to do that under the span of control allowed for those tasks for them. But if they have maybe more than one person, so like some taps, the equipment's large, it's hard to handle by yourself. So you may have a couple people working on a cutter bit, or a couple people, assembling the cutter, getting it ready, getting it set up for the measurements. Would if you have more than one person pitching in to do that, both people would need to be qualified, correct? Or would you just qualify just one of them?
Again, if you're into the big equipment, you would probably have to have both or multiple people.
Okay.
But the smaller, 2-inch, 4-inch, that's what a lot of our operators here would be looking at, would be a single individual.
Thank you, Warren. And we've got a couple questions coming through here, and I just want to make a comment too to everyone listening. If we can't get to all of the questions during our time today, we will follow up with you. So we're just going to get to as many as we can, and we'll go from there. Warren, we have a question that came through. It says, should AOC general training have span of control? Should everyone have AOC regardless if you don't have OQ training?
I will tell you that we actually, I'm still on the B31Q committee. We started that back in 2003, and we actually attempted to get it put into the standards, ASME B31.8 and B31.4, that any individual that's out on the right of way, no matter if they're qualified or unqualified, go through the AOC training. Because again, they're out there, and even if they're not performing, if they happen to be on the right of way and come across a, bubbling water or liquid on the facility or loud noise, what are they supposed to do? Very similar to what happens, the training that goes on for people going offshore. Anybody going to offshore facilities, they have to have a certain amount of training before they ever fly off or go on a boat to get onto the offshore because of the safety issue. And that would be a wonderful best practice. And there are some operators that have actually done that, but most do not.
Okay. Another question that came through, Warren, I'll ask you this one too. Should a pipeline operator have a company covered task list and a separate one for their contractors? Should the span of controls be the same for both lists?
A number of operators only allow certain things to be done by contractors. They'll do everything but say the CP and leak survey. and then they have that done by outside contractors. And so they'll actually have their covered task list separate, or somewhere in their listing have a C or an O, or however they designate it. Some operators don't allow span of control for contractors. They say everybody you bring out here will be qualified, because we're not actually on site to assist, direct, and observe. So it again, it depends on each company's operation, how they'd like to do it. But depending on how they're going to manage it, some people are so large that they have one of their subgroups actually taking care of the contractor side of OQ. So it really, depends on how you're set up to operate. David, do you have anything on that? I'm sorry.
No, we have operators that'll have an internal OQ program, internal tasks that they use for their employees, but they'll accept our enhanced series for their contractors. So that's very common. Of course, they've got an internal span of control, and as far as the span of control on internal employees versus contractors, and then I may have a different viewpoint, but the span of controls are designed for the system. You're designing a span of control for your operating system, for the equipment you use, for the system that you have, for the environment your system's in. And the system environment in a pipeline, maybe in the southeast, versus a pipeline up in the northeast is completely different. The way the pipe's been designed, the way it's installed, because of the weather conditions, et cetera. So when you're designing your span of control, it's for your system. So I don't see why you would have a separate span of control for a contractor over an internal company employee, other than the idea that I want my contractors all to be qualified, because I want to make sure they're going to do it right, because I'm not going to be on site, and or the criticalness. If you've got somebody doing close interval survey, by the time you do that close interval survey and they get that data back and they find out the data's fouled because the person doing it was under span of control and really didn't know what they were doing, you've got to backtrack quite a few miles to get that redone, and that's a lot of time consumption. So because of the task and the critical information you get from the task, you may not allow a span of control, because you want that good information. You want to make sure the person does it, that's doing it, is doing it correctly at the first time.
Very good.
Thank you, David and Warren. And Chris and David, I might pitch this question to you. Our Train the Trainer program on our course, do we discuss span of control much during that for new evaluators?
Yeah, I can take that. Yes, we during our Train the Trainer, we define all of the basics of OQ, so all sorts of terms that should be known by an evaluator personnel. And even more so, we discuss, especially concerning around the scenarios of evaluating an individual on a live jurisdictional line, so on a live line, and the requirement for the evaluator themselves to ensure they are qualified, observing that, or if they are not and the operator allows them to not be qualified themselves, but yet to evaluate on the task, to have a qualified observer there. So we do discuss those scenarios, and we do discuss the definitions in the ITS Train the Trainer.
Thank you, Chris. And I think we've got time for one more question. And this can be for anybody who wants to answer it. So when a regulator station is shut down, can you have a non-qualified person remove a bolted valve, but require a qualified employee for the fit up and replacement of the valve?
So I'm going to throw out the idea, how do you define your pipeline system? Because if you do it the way PHMSA does, and pipeline system includes the pipe, the right-of-way, facilities used to transport that gas, so you're still doing it on a pipeline system, even though it may be disconnected. So yes, it would be a qualified task, in my opinion. Warren, what do you think?
You bet. And we had, this was a huge issue back in 2003, where somebody would say, we're going to blind flange off from here to there, and we're going to work on the pipeline. And the fact is that it's still on the right of way. So it meets the 4-part test, and was written up that way. So don't go down that path again.
The trail's already been blazed there.
Somebody's trying to ride that horse. So.
Well, as Kayla mentioned, we are running out of time. So if you have any other questions, shoot them our way. We'll get back to you. Warren and David, thank you as always for your time today and sharing your very, very valuable experience and your insight. And to you, our audience, thank you for being here with us. If you have questions or concerns about your own OQ plan, the ITS team offers a range of consulting services advising on OQ plans and programs and many other industry compliance needs. And if you'd like to learn more about the solutions we briefly talked about here, and any others, any other needs you have, please reach out. We can't wait to talk to you about them. In case you haven't heard, we plan to be in Nashville, Tennessee for our 2021 ITS User Conference that's scheduled for October 14th and 15th at the iconic Lowe's Vanderbilt Hotel. Nashville's a whole lot of fun. Registration is now available, and you can sign up today by visiting our website at its-training.com/conference. I think you can see that on screen. We hope you can join us as we learn from industry experts, unveil exciting new products and services, and connect with you in person there at our user conference. And in continuation of today's discussion, we invite you to join us for our next 4th webinar in the Regulation Navigation series. It'll be on Wednesday, November 10th, and we're going to dive into the topic of integrity management. So really looking forward to that subject. Registration is available right now for that webinar. You can sign up by scanning the QR code or going to its-training.com/regnav. And we, again, thank you for being here. What a great session. We hope you continue to find these valuable, and stay safe out there.